This is a piece of fiction that was written for amusement. Please let us know where you're watching from in the comments section before we start our inquiry. The impact these stories can have is always amazing. Few cases from America's past have stuck in my memory as much as what happened on a secluded hillside in Western Virginia in the winter of 1913. A compilation of correspondence and municipal records revealed the incidents I'm going to discuss. I learned this when looking at Boone County land conflicts. What started off as ordinary archive labor turned into something much more disturbing. At that time, the only way to reach the hill, which is roughly 7 miles northeast of Madison, was via a small dirt road that wound through thick oak and hickory woodlands. According to local maps from that era, the region was mainly unoccupied, with a few homesteads claiming rough, sloping land that was unfit for intensive farming. Since the 1870s, the property had been transferred several times each. The owner stays for a maximum of a few years before leaving. Property records, which merely reflect typical sales with ordinary values, provide no explanation for this pattern. Virgil Ashmont, a widower, bought 43 acres on the western face of the hill in March 1912. Ashmont, a 51-year-old Wheeling native and former railroad surveyor, had lost his wife to typhoid the previous fall. According to county records, he gained possession that same month after making a complete cash payment. Those who recalled, a quiet man who was systematic in his purchases and usually courteous but never lingering for conversation, was reported by him from Madison's general shop. It's still unknown what attracted Ashmont to such a remote area. According to the surveyor's notes provided with the deed, the property comprised a 2-story frame house that was constructed sometime in the 1880s and was worn but structurally solid. The distance between the house and the road was about 300 yards, situated atop a tiny plateau that provided a view of the valley below. Water was drawn from a hand-dug well, a tiny. The constructions were constructed with the barn slanting slightly to one side. At first, Ashmont made very few changes. Madison's hardware ledger reveals that during the spring and summer of 1912, he bought typical supplies: basic tools, lamp oil, and nails. At first, he did all of the basic maintenance himself without hiring any employees. There were few neighbors, with the Mercer family's homestead being almost 2 miles south along the same ridge. They claimed to frequently observe Ashmont's smoke coming from his chimney and to occasionally see him on the road on his few visits to the city. In November 1912, the first sign that anything had changed appeared. Madison's postmaster reported that Ashmont started getting strange deliveries. A freight wagon from Roanoke brought heavy goods that needed to be handled carefully. Ashmont said that it included solely materials for a personal project when queried about its contents. The postmaster remembered how heavy the cartons were and how 2 men were needed to lift them onto Ashmont's wagon. During this time, Ashmont employed a Madison carpenter to assist with what he called construction work. For 3 weeks in late November and early December, Silas Drummond, a man in his 30s, worked as a carpenter on Ashmont's farm. To refresh your memory, this narrative is being listened to on the channel The Fear Behind You. Please be advised that this video has been duplicated and uploaded without my permission if you are hearing it from any other channel. If so, I respectfully request that you report it. We appreciate your support of original material. As stated, the restoration included significant internal changes to the mansion, according to a notarized statement Drummond gave years later. In order to create a single, spacious room on the 2nd level, Ashmont had Drummond take down the walls. They added more wood to strengthen the floor joists. Ashmont was meticulous about measurements, double-checking everything and making changes that Drummond didn't comprehend. The containers that were arrived earlier included chains, metal brackets, and what seemed like parts for a pulley system. When Drummond inquired about the purpose of the room, Ashmont simply said that he was constructing something to assist him in keeping valuable documents. Drummond observed that Ashmont took his meals by himself, appeared to work late into the evenings, and seldom ever spoke other than to provide directions. Several times, as Drummond was working in the lower rooms, he heard Ashmont upstairs, whispering softly, but there was no one else around. The work was finished in the middle of December. Ashmont made the promised payment. Some, plus a substantial bonus, and informed Drummond that his skills were no longer required. Drummond never went back to the property, but because the job was so odd, he could still clearly recall it. Ashmont visited Madison less frequently in January and February of 1913. The storekeeper observed that he started buying a variety of goods, including blank journals, odd amounts of candles, and particular kinds of fabric. The loneliness was evident in his appearance. He appeared drawn, even though he had always been slender. He had cuts on his hand, and calluses unsuitable for the season's light farm work. The southern neighbor, Grover Mercer, ran into Ashmont on the road in late February. They greeted each other briefly. Later, Mercer informed his wife that Ashmont had been distracted and had been looking back toward his land as though he was worried about leaving it alone. After confirming that everything was well, when Mercer inquired, Ashmont added something that caught Mercer's attention. He claimed that he was at last moving forward, that everything was starting to make sense. Ashmont neglected to pick up a box that had been waiting for him at the Madison post office for more than a week on March 3, 1913. Ashmont's punctuality was well known to the mailman. When the item was still unclaimed on March 10th, the postmaster casually referred it to the county sheriff. Out of courtesy more than concern, the sheriff made the decision to see how Ashmont was doing. On the afternoon of March 12th, he and a deputy rode out to the farm. It had been raining heavily over the past 2 days, creating a thick layer of mud on the road. They discovered Ashmont's wagon parked close to the home, with the wagon bed empty and one wheel broken. The entrance door was ajar. The sheriff yelled. No answer. They went inside. The ground floor looked somewhat typical. Simple furnishings, a chilly hearth, and cleaned and piled dishes. February was displayed on a wall-mounted calendar with no dates on it. The house was frigid, obviously unheated for a while, the sheriff observed. They ascended the he steps leading to the second level. They discovered the changes Drummond had mentioned during the landing. The entire upper level had been transformed into a single, roughly 30 by 20 foot space, but they came to a sudden stop because of what was in that room. In his formal report, the sheriff later found it difficult to explain how the area had changed. Photographs, not framed but pinned straight to the wood, filled the walls from floor to ceiling. The same woman, hundreds of them. In various years, places, and at various ages. They covered at least 20 years, judging on the fashion and photography. A chair stood in the middle of the space, exactly where Ashmont had painted a mark on the floors. The pulleys and chains Drummond had assisted in installing, though their function was still unknown, were fastened to the ceiling just above. Nothing was supported by the immobile chains. One of the diaries Ashmont had bought was on a little table next to the chair, and it was open to a page packed with legible penmanship. The woman in the pictures appeared to be between her mid-20s and late 40s. She looked happy in the first pictures, which were frequently taken outside in parks or gardens. Her face shifted, less solemn than reserved as the chronology moved along the walls. The most recent photos placed close to the sheriff's post depicted a weary, aloof woman. None of the locations in the photos were familiar to the sheriff. They didn't come from around Madison. The histories recommended more metropolitan locations, city streets, manicured gardens, and studio photographs with ornate backgrounds. There was only one paragraph in the journal entry dated February 28, 1913, and it was written in a steady, cautious style. Ashmont talked about making what he called last-minute changes to the layout of the space. He observed that the chair's distance from each shot matched his estimates, and that the angles were now accurate. He said that he could recreate full afternoons just sitting in the chair and closing his eyes, as plainly as if she were there, hear her voice. He concluded by saying that he needed to make one more change to complete what he had been creating. However, the diary provided no information regarding this last adjustment, and aside from the photos in the chair, the room didn't appear to have undergone any recent alterations. The remainder of the house was searched by the sheriff. In Ashmont's bedroom, he discovered a bed made precisely, clothes arranged perfectly, and nothing disturbed. He found in a tiny desk drawer, postmarked from Wheeling between 1889 and 1911, this correspondence was between Ashmont and a woman named Ida. The letters were homey, loving, and the typical correspondence of a long-married couple. The last letter came from a hospital in October 1911, telling Ashmont that Ida had died that night. Nothing out of the ordinary came from the barn. Simple tools, some lumber that had been stored, and feed for a horse that had vanished. There was no sign of Ashmont on the land. The nearby forests were included in the search by the sheriff. Above, he gathered a team of Madison men to comb the hillside over the course of the following 3 days. There was no sign of Ashmont. No clothes, no evidence of struggle, no clue that he had lost his way in despair or confusion. He seems to have been there recently based on his horse and wagon. However, the frigid house and the broken wheel suggested he had left some time ago. Inquiries around town turned up little. Ashmont's most recent purchase was verified by the storekeeper. On February 23rd, a tin of kerosene and 3 pounds of nails were purchased. The postmaster confirmed that Ashmont's ordered books were among the unclaimed shipment. Titles pertaining to organizational structures and memory strategies, subjects that were thought to be rather esoteric at the time, but not unheard of for an educated man to study. After Grover Mercer met Ashmont on the road on February 25th, no one recalled seeing him again. The sheriff's report, which was filed on March 20th, marked the official conclusion of the inquiry. It recorded the incident, pointed out that there was no indication of foul play, and classified. The departure of Ashmont is inexplicable. Due to delinquent taxes, the property was returned to the county. Records don't say where the photos were stored, but they were taken out the next year. The house was deserted. The case continued to be a minor curiosity in local memory for a number of years. Then something else appeared in 1918. While going through donated books, a Madison Public Library librarian came across one of the books Ashmont had ordered but never picked up. Someone had placed inside the front cover, scribbled in pencil a string of numerals. The postmaster, who still retained documents from that era, was shown them by Curious, the librarian. The numbers matched particular dates that Ashmont had made purchases, dates that deliveries had arrived, and dates that showed up in all of the journals that were discovered in his home. However, they also matched something else. The librarian discovered that they matched dates of important Wheeling events during Ashmont's years there, when she cross-referenced them with historical data. They specifically matched dates from municipal archives, registry offices, and civic records. On September 14, 1909, a retired Madison clerk who was originally from Wheeling identified one of the dates. He remembered it as the day of a big public gathering that attracted a lot of attention in Wheeling's Eastern District. This led to a more thorough analysis of the data. A trend became apparent. Ashmont had marked each date in accordance with recorded public events, civic gatherings, or noteworthy events. Even though there were incomplete documents from that time period, they often indicated the same streets and communities where Ashmont and Ida had resided. The clerk sent a request to Wheeling's city archives. Due to the war's disturbances, the response took many months to arrive, but it proved what the clerk had suspected. Additionally, a number of these dates were found in social notices, event announcements, and personal records from the time Ashmont and his wife had been involved in. The neighborhood. The archive notes mentioned Ida's participation in community events, her involvement in a variety of civic activities, and her attendance at gatherings across the communities where they had resided. According to the notes, Virgil and she frequently appeared together in local newspapers' social pages and attended these events together. What the sheriff had discovered in that second-floor room was reframed by this setting. Ashmont hadn't been building a straightforward monument. He had been trying to rebuild something, a methodical account of their common experiences, things they'd seen together, and places they'd visited together. Why? Up until 1923, the question remained unsolved. In that year, the Madison County clerk was called by a Wheeling lawyer who was settling an estate. The estate belonged to Ida Ashmont's recently deceased distant relative. One of the items was a January 1912 letter from Virgil Ashmont that was never mailed. Ashmont explained his decision to depart in it. Wheeling. He wrote that it was intolerable to stay in the city. He was reminded of Ida's absence by every structure, street corner, and familiar place. He said he couldn't live with places that reminded him of what he had lost all the time. When he bought the property in Virginia, Ashmont said he wanted to get away from the unpleasant recollections of the city and concentrate only on preservation. He explained his plan to establish a specific area where he could keep. A detailed account of their lives together, away from outside distractions and anyone who would doubt his strategies. He planned to construct something that was solely concerned with protecting what was most important, his ties to the years they had spent together. Ashmont acknowledged at the end of the letter that the plan could seem strange to others, but he noted that he required this in order to construct something intentional and long-lasting, rather than depending on fading memories dispersed throughout a lifetime. He would construct a location where everything was comprehensive, methodical, and well-organized. The dates in the book, the evidence in the house, and this letter all pointed to a story. After losing his wife, Ashmont withdrew to a remote area where he could devote himself to a thorough preservation system. He was able to keep an organized link to their common history because to the photos, the exact placement, the journals, and the ritual of sitting in that chair. However, it was still insufficient to explain his absence. A find was made in a ravine about a quarter-mile from Ashmont's land in 1928 by a survey team working on a planned road extension through the area. They discovered fragments of skeletal remains that had been worn down and dispersed by animals throughout time. A few remnants of fabric suggested period-appropriate attire. There were no personal belongings left that might be used for identification. The county medical examiner concluded that the remains were male, perhaps 50 to 60 years old, and that their height and build matched descriptions. From Ashmont. After years of exposure to the weather, the cause of death was unknown. The site indicated a fall, perhaps in winter, when the ground would have been dangerous due to ice. One detail was mentioned in the examiner's report. The remains were discovered near the base of a steep valley that was hidden from view from Ashmont's land and the main road. It would be simple to overlook, particularly in bad weather or when the light is diminishing. The conclusion reached was simple. Ashmont had taken A out in late February or early March of 1913, perhaps trying to get to town in spite of challenging circumstances or looking for something in the woods. On the snowy slope, he had lost his balance. His body had just never been discovered during the first search because of the distant location and the weather at that time of year. Officially, the case was concluded, but many who looked attentively at it were still troubled by some elements. The carpenter who assisted with the changes, Silas Drummond, made an additional remark in 1929, after discovering the remains. He made reference to something that had appeared unimportant at the time and that he had left out of his first account. He had gone to the second level to get his tools on his last day of employment. Ashmont was standing right in the middle of the room, where the chair would eventually go. He was reciting what sounded like descriptions in a voice that was hardly audible. The hue of a clothing, the way light streamed through a certain window, particular. Discussions from previous years. Years later, Drummond discovered Ashmont had been testing himself, confirming what he could still retain without prompts, to make sure his system would function as intended. Drummond had believed Ashmont was practicing something, possibly intending to record it in one of the journals. And then there was the last journal entry. In order to finish the space, Ashmont had written about making one more change. No proof of this addition had been discovered by the sheriff. The space seems completed. What then was Ashmont going to add? In 1935, a local historian studying the history of the land found a misfiled item in the county archives. It was a February 20th, 1913, receipt from a Roanoke metalworker. Ashmont had placed a special order for a set of metal frames that were precisely the right size to accommodate photos that were intended to be positioned at precise angles. Despite being finished, the order was never picked up. Ashmont intended to make more adjustments to the photo arrangement in order to place each picture in relation to the chair at a predetermined angle. It was unclear if this was based on a theory of visual organization or just his own evolving system. It was obvious that his time was running out. The main route to Madison ran roughly parallel to the gully where the remains were discovered. Ashmont would have passed somewhere nearby if he had been traveling to pick up the order to finish his project. It could have been really cold in early March. A man who was distracted by. His mind was so preoccupied with the changes he intended to make that he could easily lose his balance on an icy hill. However, individuals who looked into the situation pointed forth another possibility. There was no direct way to town from the ravine. Ashmont would have had to take a different route to get there. This implied that the driver had either intentionally strayed off the road for unclear reasons or experienced severe confusion in the tough weather. There were no signs of any odd activity on the equipment that was discovered in Ashmont's barn. The instruments were cautiously stored. The chains and rope were coiled correctly. There was no indication of any planning for anything more than routine property upkeep. Still, the timing was remarkable. He vanished just as he was ready to make what he referred to as the final change in his project. Additionally, the remains' placement in a position that necessitated a particular departure from any rational approach added a factor that wasn't entirely consistent with the conclusion of simple incidental. Passing away while traveling. A scholar from the University of Virginia wrote a short study in 1942 that looked at historical examples of people who had created complex systems for keeping track of their memories and personal documents. Ashmont's case took center stage. The researcher observed that these systems frequently grew more complicated over time, even while they can offer structure and purpose during times of sadness. The person may realize that the system needs to be improved continuously, which could result in continuous alterations and revisions that were never able to reach the desired level of excellence. According to the study, Ashmont's decision to isolate himself and concentrate so intensely on the project may have caused him to become disconnected from everyday issues. According to the researcher's theory, Ashmont might have become so engrossed in his job by February 1913 that regular vigilance regarding the weather and safe travel had lost significance. This argument provided a potential rationale for the departure from the road, for its existence in that gully, but it was only a theory. There was no note. Although it implied that Ashend was still working on his research, The last journal post showed no signs of discomfort or carelessness. Over the years, the property underwent multiple ownership changes. The house, which was already in bad shape when Ashmont vanished, got worse. Only the foundation and a small amount of structural framing survived by the 1950s. That room's location on the second floor fell in a storm. In 1947, a fire destroyed the county's collection of pictures. The Historical Society preserved the journals for a longer period of time, but during a 1961 reorganization they were thrown out because it was thought that they had no bearing on local history. The recorded record, purchase receipts, the sheriff's report, the letters, the Wheeling civic records, and the numerous comments made over the years are all that are left. These pieces show a pattern of a guy trying to make something lasting in reaction to severe loss. It is impossible to say whether he was successful in any significant sense. Drummond's last recollection of Ashmont, standing in that room and repeating specifics, implies that the system served a purpose, at least initially. However, preservation and organization methods need constant upkeep. When does the benefit outweigh the amount of work needed? And there's the matter of what Ashmont envisioned happening once he accomplished his objective. Even if he was extremely well organized, he would still be by himself in a house on a far-off mountainside, surrounded by pictures of a deceased person, thanks to this complex system that preserved his documents and memories of Ida. She was not returning because of the preservation. It was only keeping him connected to the things he had lost. Maybe it was the whole intent. Maybe Ashmont, who had lost Ida, wanted to deal with that grief in a planned, disciplined way, rather than letting time gradually ease it. The room turned into a decision: actively uphold. Awareness of what was important, or let it to progressively disappear as life goes on. The case's latest inquiry took place in 1968. Ashmont's property was located by a graduate student studying early 20th century reactions to loss and grief. The home has vanished. They had filled the well. The property was now woods again. She walked about the region for an afternoon, using ancient survey maps to determine the approximate location of the house. In her research journal, she stated that the hillside was peaceful and secluded in a way that seemed intentional rather than coincidental. She could see why someone would select it if they were looking for privacy for a personal endeavor. However, she also noted that she felt completely alone and that she couldn't fathom spending months there by herself, particularly while working on such an extremely taxing project. Gazing out over the valley from where Ashmont's second-floor room would have been, she attempted to visualize what he had gone through every day while sitting in. That chair, the woods, the far-off ridge, and the sky would have all remained the same. For Ashmont, however, the exercise had little to do with the current perspective. It was about creating something that only existed in structured memory by utilizing the journals, the photos, and the exact angles he had calculated. The research conducted by the students was never published. Ashmont's case became another preserved oddity as she went on to other subjects, and it was occasionally brought up in writings concerning historical reactions to loss that have mostly been forgotten. It wasn't the intricacy of Ashmont's project, or even the mystery surrounding his precise fate, that most impressed me throughout my own study. It was the fundamental query raised by the case. What are we prepared to construct in order to protect our values? Ashmont made the decision to live alone, focus intently, and turn his home into a well-organized memorial to common experiences. He put months of work into a system that, even if everything went according to plan, could only preserve a connection to something that was essentially historical. Was this an act of avoidance or devotion? Both. Most likely. It's not always easy to distinguish between appreciating someone's significance in our lives and becoming obsessed with their absence. Genuine affection was evident in Ashmont's letters to Ida that were discovered in his desk. He showed commitment by being devoted to their common past. However, the second-floor room alluded to something that had transcended constructive memory into a realm that cut him off from any potential for creating new relationships or goals. Complexity is increased by the fact that he vanished while ostensibly still working on his project. We might read his simple abandonment of the property, leaving it behind, as an admission that the system was ultimately unable to fulfill his desires. However, it is likely that he fell into a ravine while traveling to gather supplies for future upgrades. This implies a person who is still devoted and believes in refinement's worth. Or it implies someone who had become so engrossed in the project that basic knowledge of the weather and safe travel practices had taken a back seat. There are few things we can be sure of. A man's wife passed away. To preserve their common past, he devised a complex system. He vanished. It's possible that his remains were discovered. The house has vanished. The pictures are no longer there. The journals have vanished. The pattern, the recorded behavior, and the decisions he made are what endure, and maybe that's its own method of preservation. In order to preserve the vividness and accessibility of their history, Ashmont wished to keep a precise, well-organized record of Ida. Rather, Ashmont himself is still vivid. Not the wheeling railroad surveyor, not the civic-minded husband, but the lonely man in the hilltop home, surrounded by hundreds of photos, sitting in a carefully arranged chair, trying to preserve. We are also unable to determine whether that would have satisfied him. His property was situated on a hillside, stays mostly unaltered. These days, the road that went through those woods is paved. There has been some development in the area, but not much. Every now and then, hikers go by, not knowing what happened there more than a century ago. The remains were discovered in an unmarked ravine. This specific section of Virginia hillside is devoid of any monuments, historical plaques, or other indications that anything noteworthy occurred there. And perhaps that is a good thing. Ashmont picked that spot because of its seclusion, its separation from observation. It would go against what he was looking for: a private area for a private project, a place where he could work without interference or criticism to mark it now and call attention to it. Even so, I occasionally think about that room. The hours Ashmont must have spent rearranging and rearranging those photos, calculating angles, trying out different positions, and the first time he sat in the chair after finishing the installation and closed his eyes, attempting to recreate an afternoon from years ago. Completed it. Labor? Was there a clearer way for him to access those memories? Did the system, even momentarily, fulfill his expectations? Or did he sit there and see that nothing could truly replace what had been lost? No matter how carefully everything was documented, how carefully everything was positioned, or how many pictures were taken. Even if they are prompted, reinforced, and meticulously maintained, organized records are still just that, records. Not the moment, not the person, not the thing itself. What would happen if he did realize that? Did he find value in the process, accept it, and go on anyway, even if the ultimate objective was still unattainable? Or was that insight a factor in what transpired in early March 1913? I haven't yet mentioned a detail from the sheriff's report. The smell hit him when he first walked into the second-floor room, before he saw the journals, the chair, or the photographs. Candle wax, not deterioration or neglect. Dozens of candles had just been lit in the room, their wax pulling on various surfaces. For a man who was intent on. Why use candlelight instead of the more dependable lamp oil he routinely bought for methodical organization, clarity, and precision? Unless the system included the lighting itself. Unless the flicker, the shadows, and the particular quality of the light were intended to evoke a particular memory or recollection from the past. Photographs taken in candlelight appear different from those taken in daylight or by lamplight. There is more contrast. Details fade. Flickering light can make faces appear almost animated. Is Ashmont attempting to replicate the atmosphere as well as the content of memories? If so, what level of specificity had his system reached? To get the precise reconstruction he wanted, how many variables was he trying to control? The more I looked into the case, the more questions I had. And maybe that's what studying it is really worth. Not discovering conclusive answers regarding Virgil Ashmont's fate, but investigating issues such as how to preserve what is important, deal with significant loss, and create meaning, when the basis upon which our lives have been built is taken away. Ashmont's approach was radical by any measure. The majority of people in similar situations do not turn their houses into complex preservation systems. However, the instinct he was reacting to, the need to preserve what was significant, and the need to stay connected is universal. Everybody has a copy of Ashmont's room, picture albums, letters that have been saved, and other items that we hold on to because they are significant to us rather than because they are useful. The differences are of degree rather than kind. Even though the tangible proof has disappeared and the individuals involved have long since passed away, I believe that is what makes this case worth looking into. It presents us with a recognizable, albeit extreme, version of ourselves. Someone attempting to protect what was important. A person confronting the boundaries of what can be accomplished with personal effort. A lone individual striving to preserve something that was essentially in the past, using journals, photographs, and carefully considered angles. The residence is now gone. Decades ago, the second floor fell. Vegetation has reclaimed the foundation. Nothing would set the location apart from any other forested hillside in western Virginia if you were to visit it now. Although the precise spot where the remains were discovered was never marked permanently, the ravine is still there. People who are unaware of what happened in these forests a century ago are transported by the road that passes close by. However, the records continue to show this tendency. The reports and receipts. These letters reveal a series of decisions, from sadness to focused attention, from sensible coping to something that alienated Ashmont and ultimately might have played a role in his disappearance. And it poses the question, what would we do? In an uncomfortable way. To what extent would we go? When does seclusion turn into preservation? When does the mechanism meant to keep us connected turn into Clear's throat, the thing that keeps us from creating new goals? Ashmont didn't respond. Those inquiries, at least not in a manner that was captured on tape. One winter, he just vanished, leaving behind an unfinished project and a room filled with pictures. It's unclear if he lost his footing in inclement weather by accident, if something else happened, if he was as engrossed in the project as it seemed, or if he was more conscious of his situation than the evidence indicates. We have a case study of a man. They took unusual steps to preserve their shared past after losing someone they loved. For a while, at least, the measures produced something extraordinary. However, the man is no longer there. The documents are no longer there. The actual location where it all happened is no longer there. All that is left is this: a pattern that has been saved in archives, a series of events that may still be reconstructed, a narrative about the boundaries of our control and the price of trying, perhaps in a manner Ashmont wouldn't have expected, that fulfills its own preservation purpose. Not the particular memories he was trying to preserve, but rather the general trend of how people react to time, loss, and the difficulty of holding on to what is important. In order to keep a thorough and well-organized record of their joint existence, he wished to save Ida. Rather, we honor him. Preservation, The result he had worked so hard to attain came to pass, but not in the way he had hoped. Although the photos are no longer there, the fact that he organized them using. He took such care that he sat with them, trying to keep the bond that is preserved in history. Maybe that's the only form of long-term preservation that truly works. The preservation of the fact that someone cared enough to try, that someone dedicated months of solitary labor to producing something that mattered to them, rather than the preservation of particular content. In his 1929 farewell speech, carpenter Silas Drummond made one more observation. During the 3 weeks he spent working on, he never once saw the man smile on Ashmont's land, not when the big construction was finished, not when a challenging challenge was resolved, and not even when the work was going well. According to Drummond, Ashmont remained composed and concentrated the entire time, yet there was a persistent undercurrent of melancholy. This seemingly insignificant element points to a significant aspect of Ashmont's state during those months. Despite his meticulous and careful construction, he was not finding serenity or contentment. It was just something he had to do whether or not it was consoling. And that's possibly the most human aspect of this whole situation. Sometimes we embark on initiatives because we can't imagine not doing them, not because they would make us happy. The alternative, accepting the loss and continuing without a sense of direction, seems unattainable. Thus, we construct, arrange, and establish systems that provide us with a focal point, even if they cannot, in the end, bring back what we have lost. Ashmont organized his pictures and constructed his room. He kept journals. He sat in his carefully placed chair and tried to stay in touch with a person who was no longer there. Then, on a winter's day in 1913, he disappeared into the woods. For a while, at least, the system he created outlasted him. For decades, the room stood. After being saved, the photos were lost. After being preserved, the journals were thrown away. The home fell apart. The terrain went back to the wilderness. And now, almost a century later, the recorded pattern is all that's left. Letters, reports, and receipts that describe what occurred, even if they are unable to explain why. Was it worthwhile? Did Ashmont's months of solitary labor accomplish anything? Was it consoling to be in that room surrounded by pictures, or did it just make the absence more noticeable? We are unable to know. All we can see are the decisions he made, the work he put in, and the system he created. Additionally, we can acknowledge, if uncomfortably, that we are all susceptible to the desire that drives those decisions. The impulse to create something permanent in reaction to temporary circumstances, the need to cling to what counts, and the fear of losing connection to what we have cherished. Ashmont went above what most people would do. He shut himself off entirely. He devoted months to one goal. He turned his whole home into a monument to conservation, and he was not saved by it. But Ida didn't return. It failed to stop. His disappearance in the ravine, but a record was made. It wasn't the record he wanted, but it was still a record. A documented example of how people react to loss. A pattern that endures despite the loss of the guy, the house, the photos, and the meticulously planned system. And maybe that has some value. Maybe because we can still piece together what happened. The fact that we can still look at Ashmont's decisions and consider what we would do in a comparable situation gives his work a significance he never expected. Now the hillside is silent. The home has vanished. The remains were discovered in a gully that resembles any other ravine in western Virginia. The place is unmarked. Nothing suggests that anything out of the ordinary ever occurred there. However, the pattern continues. The recorded options are still in place. Additionally, Yellowed receipts and faded letters from a man who created a room full of photos, then vanished one winter, leaving behind a legacy, may still be found in archives in Madison and Wheeling. Question that we are currently unable to properly address. When does preservation turn into a completely different thing? And is what we aspire to acquire ever really worth the price of that transformation? To that question, I have no answer. I doubt that anyone does. I have this case, these documents, this pattern of decisions that were made over a century ago and can still be studied, and I am aware that something extraordinary is happening on a mountainside in Western Virginia that appears to be innumerable others, existed in the past. An entire room filled with pictures, a chair arranged mathematically, a man sitting by himself with his eyes closed, trying to protect what was most important to him. It was short-lived. The space has vanished. The man has left. The pictures are no longer there. The documented pattern of human choice and consequence, rather than the physical artifacts, preserves the knowledge that it existed, that someone cared enough to make it, and that months of solitary labor were put into its production. And ultimately, that might be the greatest. We have an honest method of preservation, accurate documentation of what was tried, what was constructed, what was lost, and what endures in spite of it, not flawless preservation of what was.